Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Haitian Revolution Part 5, The War of Knives by Extra History. So last time we saw as the French commissioners Sontenax and Polverel arrived in Saint-Domingue and officially freed the slaves. Upon that, one of the main revolutionary leaders, Toussaint Louverture, decided to join up with the French. Today, we'll get to see which of those many factions managed to gain the upper hand. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video and subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date with all my new uploads. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Port-au-Prince, 1796. The British soldiers come ashore and die. Come ashore and die. One of the largest expeditions to this point in British history. 20,000 men and thousands of German mercenaries disembark. Within 4 months, most are cut down by yellow fever. Back in Britain, troops riot upon the announcement of a deployment to Saint-Domingue. British forces end up hiring 7,000 black mercenaries to fight for them. Some reports will claim that 60% of the British expedition, 15,000 men, will die.
Yeah, so this is a pretty common occurrence, right? We see these troops being sent who are not used to this type of environment, and they will die in very large quantities. British troops, we'll see it with French troops later, right? They get diseased, usually with yellow fever, and they die, right? It is ravaging the ranks of all these soldiers being sent in, which obviously gives an advantage to those who are already there in Saint-Domingue, who are used to this environment.
And those that make it to the interior of the island find something frightening. The troops of Brigadier General Toussaint Louverture and his ally André Rigaud fighting like professional soldiers. They do, after all, have years of combat experience. But soon, instead of fighting the British, they will fight each other.
Yep. We've said that this is a very dynamic conflict. We've seen how factional this revolution is, right? It's not just about, well, you got the white people and the people of color, and no, it breaks down even further than that. And this episode, at least judging from the title, The War of Knives, and the time period that we're in, I imagine this is going to be focused on that infighting among these different factions, right? These people who were all leading, these enslaved people who had risen up and who had now been freed. There's going to be a lot of fighting amongst each other, trying to claim control of the territory of the colony.
With general emancipation declared and the departure of the Spanish, things started to level out for Toussaint. Not calm down necessarily. I mean, he was still fighting. But with the British pinned to the coast and rivals fighting low-intensity conflicts, he could turn to actually governing. He was in control of the North Province, while his ally and rival, André Rigaud, a free person of color who'd long taken part in the group's insurrection, controlled the South.
Right, and André Rigaud is probably the most prominent of these leaders at this moment, aside from Toussaint. Right, Toussaint is obviously the number one, and will remain so until the end of his life, but in this moment, Rigaud is probably the second most prominent, though this will sort of shake up over time. And, as they said, there's still a lot of conflict and violence happening, but things have calmed down to a degree where we can now see how these guys govern, right? Because they're now essentially ruling over this territory. Now, they're fighting, Toussaint here. We talked about how he joined up with the French last time, right? So he's fighting on behalf of the Republic, but the situation on the ground is that he individually is ruling over this territory that he's conquered, right? He has a lot of authority, and we're going to see what sort of policies he implements, right? It gives us sort of an understanding of, well, if Toussaint was to rule this territory, perhaps one day, what would he do? How would he behave?
Thus, the colony was essentially divided into two rival administrative centers that would ultimately come to blows in what would be known as the War of Knives. But in 1793, the word was consolidation. Finally, Toussaint had a chance to enact his vision for an integrated post-slavery society, one that brought the white, free people of color, and black populations into a peaceful, functioning whole, which would prove...
Right, and that is Toussaint's vision. Now, as we know, in the long run, that's not what's going to happen, right? And a lot of people disagree with that vision from a variety of different perspectives. But Toussaint has this vision of a sort of multiracial society with everybody living alongside each other, right? It's the idea of society composed of the people of color, the sort of mixed population who were free before the revolution, the black population who were enslaved and were now free, and the white population, right? These three different groups, Toussaint's vision was to have all of them living together in unity. Now, as I think they're about to point out, this is a difficult task, right? This is a lot harder than maybe it sounds. And it probably sounds pretty difficult in the first place.
Prove difficult.
Yeah.
Part of that difficulty was that Saint-Domingue's economy was dysfunctional by design. France had wanted the colonists to be dependent on France, and had therefore restricted industry, to the point that the island was solely focused on producing sugar, coffee, and indigo.
Right. I mean, that was the point of Saint-Domingue as a colony, right? The economy is extremely extractive. The point is, they have this system, it's extremely exploitative labor system where they constantly need to bring in more and more slaves because they keep dying, where all they're going to be producing, essentially, is indigo, coffee, and sugar. France, the metropole, they don't want Saint-Domingue to have any sort of independent industries. They don't want them to be self-sufficient. No, they want Saint-Domingue to be completely dependent on France, right? They're the metropole, they're the mother country. This is the system that they've created, but, if you're trying to operate a little more autonomously, that's going to cause a lot of issues.
It was restricted from making any moves that might make it self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it had to import food to sustain its population.
Right, so you can think about that. You have this colony, Saint-Domingue, where they have an incredible amount of agriculture, of farming, and yet they can't even produce their own food. They are so dedicated to cash crops, primarily sugar, but also indigo and coffee, that they need to get food imported. We see this with a lot of economies, even today, economies that are so devoted to one particular resource or good, because it makes them so much money, or because in this case, it makes France so much money, and they're forcing Saint-Domingue to operate in this way. Of course, the people who are running the colony, before the revolution, the planters, well, they didn't really have an issue with this. I mean, a lot of them wanted some more autonomy from France, but these people were making incredible amounts of money from producing that sugar, coffee, and indigo. But now, we're in a different situation, right? Agriculture, the plantation economy, has been decimated by years of warfare. And so, there's sort of an opportunity among those who are currently ruling the colony to decide which direction do we go now, right? Should we try and return to what we had, but without slavery, or should we try and do something different?
So the only system that worked was to continue producing sugar, coffee, and indigo. But a few problems there. First, the destruction of the plantation.
Well, right, and this is ultimately the decision that is made that they've got to continue with this cash crop economy. And we'll talk about sort of why and why that's a problem and how they try and go about doing that. But in the end, the determination is made both from, the French commissioners who say, hey, you got to keep the money rolling, right? That's why we're here, to keep Saint-Domingue as a profitable colony. And those leaders like Toussaint who are thinking, well, we're in a sort of risky position here. We got to try and keep the exports going to keep France happy, to keep them on our side.
Sugar, coffee, and indigo. But a few problems there. First, the destruction of the plantation infrastructure early in the revolution meant that major rebuilding would need to take place. Second, many of those plantations still had living owners, many of them refugees, and could not simply be given away under French law. They had to be managed in trust. And finally, no one wanted to go back to doing the same awful work they'd been forced to do when they were enslaved. But Toussaint and Rigaud solved that last situation using the same means everyone in this conflict always used: military force. They used troops to force people back onto the plantations. Now, this was not slavery. It was forced work. The difference being that the workers were paid, physical punishment was forbidden, and no one's spouse or children were getting sold away.
Right, so this is one of the more controversial parts of Toussaint Louverture's legacy, right? Toussaint is depicted as this great revolutionary hero, a liberator. But Toussaint was an eminently practical leader, and so he makes the determination that we've got to keep the money going. If we don't, France is going to crush us. This is the only way we're going to survive as a colony, somewhat autonomous, is if we keep this production going. And that is the same call that a lot of Haitian leaders will make following Toussaint, right? There are sort of several opportunities where you have leaders of Haiti who have to make the call, well, should we continue the plantation economy or should we try something else? And more often than not, especially in this period and the immediate follow-up, they decide we have to keep the plantation economy going. either because we need that to stay close to France or we need that to keep ourselves afloat. That's the determination that's made. And some people see this moment as, maybe an opportunity to try something different. I don't know if this moment in particular, but I do think, later in the revolution, maybe when Haiti gains its independence, there is a moment when they could have tried something different, and the leadership decided not to. I do think there's a missed opportunity, but we're looking a little bit ahead. The question is, you want to return to this plantation economy, how do you do it? And what Toussaint lands on, and a lot of his successors land on, is you essentially need to coerce or force labor. Right? They don't return to slavery, but they're going to coerce people to return to those plantations. Now, there absolutely is this is distinguished from slavery, right? They're different, but you can imagine that a lot of these people being sent back to the plantations, they're not very happy, right? I mean, they may be avoiding the physical violence, they may not be being sold, and they are getting paid, but they're sort of saying, you're forcing us to do the same back-breaking labor that led to this revolution. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of revolts in this period against these revolutionary leaders, right? Toussaint is faced with a lot of different revolts that he has to manage, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, right? So like I said, this is one of those more controversial parts of Toussaint's legacy that doesn't necessarily line up with the depiction of this grand revolutionary liberator, but this is what Toussaint feels like he has to do to keep things moving.
They also had rights and protections as citizens, including the right to legally marry. This is a stain on Toussaint's legacy, as were the violent repressions he unleashed on those who rose against this forced labor program. But in Toussaint's estimation,
and I'll point out that, like I said, a lot of revolts emerge because of this. Now, Toussaint, he was a charming guy, right? He was this pretty charismatic leader, so there are many cases of Toussaint being able to go to these revolts and to say, hey, I understand you're upset. I'm going to get rid of this overseer or, whoever, this revolutionary captain who's abusing you, whatever the complaint was, and we're going to return to the plantation. Your work is essential for the revolution. But there are also cases when Toussaint's honey words didn't work, and when he puts down these revolts, how does he do that? Well, Toussaint doesn't do it himself. He knows that'd be bad for his reputation. So he sends Desailly, right, his number 2 guy. He becomes Toussaint's enforcer. He is the guy who, when dirty work needs to be done, Toussaint doesn't want to do it, doesn't want to muddy his hands. He sends Desailly in, and he's going to be the one who takes over when Toussaint is gone, right? So, sort of important stuff happening here.
This, and other autocratic actions he would take, were necessary to guard the freedoms that they had won.
That's what he argues.
Knew that Saint-Domingue, fairly or not, would be seen as a test case for abolitionism. And what happened there would send a message across the world about whether freed slaves could not only be integrated into a wider society, but could build and sustain their own government.
Yeah, I mean, this is looking a little far ahead, right? There's a lot of decisions Toussaint has to make in the moment, but if you do zoom out a little bit, there is a recognition that Saint-Domingue is not going to have many, if any, allies on the international stage, right? It is a slave colony whose slaves rose up and freed themselves. This is something that is seen as frightening and abhorrent to most of the white people around the world, You can look at the United States, right? Many politicians in the United States are horrified by what is happening in Haiti, or Saint-Domingue at this point, because they fear a slave uprising in their own country, right? Same thing from the Brits. I know Britain has a strong abolitionist movement, and you can find abolitionists in all these different countries who sympathize with the Haitians, though, there's also a lot of abolitionists who sort of, take the middle route, where they say, well, I want abolition, but not that quickly and not that violent, right? So even among the abolitionists, it's hard to find friends. But, a lot of Brits are horrified by this. They're worried that they'll have slave uprisings in their own colonies, right? So, Saint-Domingue, Toussaint leading Saint-Domingue, which he doesn't lead in its entirety, but he will, Toussaint is sort of thinking, well, I need to stick with the ally I have, which is the French Republic. And to keep that ally, I need to keep producing these cash crops, right? That's his perspective. And I think you can very much understand his motivations. You understand why he thought that was necessary, and maybe it was, But, like I said, this is a controversial part of his career where he does resort to these, violent, coercive tactics in order to keep the plantation economy running. And unfortunately, this is going to sort of establish a precedent for his successors.
If Saint-Domingue collapsed, not only might slavery return, in fact, there were big whites in Paris advocating for just that,
Yep.
but opponents would draw the conclusion that abolition had been a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
and such a determination would have global consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And Toussaint increasingly believed he was the only one that could secure the revolution and the freedoms they'd won. As he fought the British, his
And he was probably close to right, by the way. I know in the end, right, Toussaint will not be the one who leads Haiti to its full independence, but Toussaint is probably close to right when he says that. I mean, oftentimes you hear comparisons between Toussaint and Napoleon. Both in their particular context were such singular figures. Toussaint was such a singular figure during the Haitian Revolution. He really was the one guy that sort of could have led them forward and maybe could have come to a different solution, a different outcome than the way things actually sort of end up. I mean, Haiti does get its independence eventually, but Toussaint was the best guy for the job. He was sort of a singular, talent among his contemporaries, and he was France's best chance for holding on to Saint-Domingue, something that Napoleon never truly understands.
power growing, he began to edge out political rivals, even allies.
Yep.
When one longtime rival rebelled and captured the colony's governor, accusing him of trying to reinstate slavery, Toussaint rescued the man and got named lieutenant governor for the service. During the election for the colony's representatives in France, Toussaint steered his rival to victory so that then they would be forced to live in France, far from his developing power center. He would get himself
Yep, he knows that Sontenex and Polverel are, in this moment, sort of his two biggest challengers. As in, they directly represent the French Republic, and they are literally the guys that freed the slaves. Now, to be fair, a lot of the slaves had already freed themselves, but they're the ones who officially sort of bring emancipation to Saint-Domingue. These guys are pretty popular. Toussaint, he doesn't want to fight against these guys. He wants to get them out of there so he can sort of truly establish himself as the one and true leader or governor of the colony, which is what we're seeing here.
declared governor general shortly afterward. And in 1798, he started conducting his own diplomacy. He concluded a secret peace with the British, where they would withdraw their troops and naval blockade from Saint-Domingue in exchange for the return of French royalists and a promise that Toussaint would not export the uprising to Barbados.
Right, so we're seeing here that Haiti has not yet declared independence. We've still got a couple of years to go, but Toussaint is increasingly taking more and more autonomy, right? He's acting on his own initiative and, frankly, to the benefit of his colony. This is why I'm saying Toussaint was France's best chance to hold on to Saint-Domingue, or to Haiti, right? Now, what Napoleon isn't going to like is that he acts so independently. However, Toussaint's really the one guy who has control of the situation on the ground. If not him, then there's really no one else who can take control. And so Toussaint, he's bringing things to a calm. He's sort of trying to bring peace. He's making deals, negotiating behind the scenes, right? And you can see, we talked about previously in previous episodes how Toussaint was quite a deal maker, a negotiator. He's bringing back royalists. He's bringing back plantation owners, which, like I said, a lot of the rebels didn't like that. But Toussaint, his vision of this sort of multiracial society where everyone lives in harmony, he's trying to bring everyone together. He's someone who can work with, all factions. He can work with the, formerly enslaved people who have risen up, who are still in rebellion. He can work with the French authorities. He can negotiate with the Brits and the Spanish. He can work with those plantation owners, many of whom have left the colony, right? He's good at wheeling and dealing. He can really work with everyone, right? That's one of the things that makes him such a brilliant political leader, even if you don't agree with all the decisions he made.
That concluded, he sent a representative to the United States, striking a deal with John Adams so the undeclared naval war between the US and France would not affect trade with...
Right, so Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, I'm sort of using them interchangeably, but we're still the colony of Saint-Domingue, though you sort of want to start saying Haiti as it becomes more and more independent under Toussaint. Of course, Toussaint does not have legitimate authority to do all of this, but he's essentially, in a pretty unofficial capacity, sort of normalizing relationship with his neighbors, with Britain, and the British colonies of the region, with the United States, right? This is very skilled statesmanship, right? He's trying to establish Saint-Domingue's position in a time of maybe not of peace, but not of, immediate uprising and revolution. He's trying to, like I said, normalize relations.
Saint-Domingue. Because you see, another running theme to think about, and you're keeping track of all of these, right? Was that Saint-Domingue was always a piece in a larger game.
Yep.
The United States was right next door, as was British Barbados, and France supported whatever leader, in their estimation, best served their interests.
Right.
And that interplay of various powers sponsoring or intervening in the island's affairs will become a major part of Haitian history all the way to present day.
Oh, yeah.
In other words,
Yeah, there are many instances of interventions, occupations from other countries, in the case of Haiti. Of course, France, during the 20th century, the United States, right? So Haiti will always be sort of at the mercy, frankly, of a lot of these bigger powers. Toussaint recognizes this, and so he's trying to work that interplay, normalize relations, work with all these different powers, and he understands the position he's in.
Saul was increasingly behaving like the leader of an independent nation,
Yep.
though he did so with the veneer of French support.
Exactly.
He was, after all, a brigadier general of the Republic, and would remain so as long as the French upheld their abolition of slavery. In fact, Toussaint had essentially ejected the previous governor. Meanwhile, relationships between Toussaint and Rigaud began to sour, partially due to that expelled governor playing political games about which one was higher ranking, and partially due to the fact that they both wanted total control. Soon, Rigaud appealed to France, casting himself as the loyal revolutionary, and Toussaint as a dictatorial usurper who wanted independence. Toussaint, by contrast, began claiming that Rigaud planned to reimpose slavery. A slender Rigaud turned back on him. Of course, neither wanted that, but there were factions on both sides willing to believe it.
Yeah, I mean, there is some politics and ideology here, but this is primarily a power struggle, right? At this point, this is a blatant power struggle between these two rivals, right? And they're going to throw whatever accusations they hope will take the other guy down.
Toussaint had invited back many plantation owners in order to rebuild the economy.
Yep.
So it seemed plausible from that angle. And Rigaud had rebuilt the southern province with a caste system with the free people of color on top.
Yeah, I mean, there's, of course, different ways to depict Toussaint. As with any historical figure, we have the sources we have, and you can read into those sources differently. You think of someone like a Napoleon. Whenever I talk about Napoleon, I always say, well, some people see him as someone who truly wanted to bring peace to France, but he was forced to keep fighting because he was surrounded by enemies. And some people say it was his ambition that undid him, right? He couldn't help but keep fighting, trying to conquer Europe. What's the truth? Something in between you can determine. With Toussaint, there's sort of the idea, right? And we're talking about I'm setting this up like a binary, but of course it's not really a binary. There's always something in between. But there's sort of on one end the idea that Toussaint is this eminently self-interested individual, and he didn't care about the people of Saint-Domingue, and he was just trying to cement his position. And then, on the other hand, there's the position that he was this great liberator, this great revolutionary leader who truly wanted to secure freedom for the people of Saint-Domingue, and he did what he needed to in order to accomplish that. Now, once again, the truth is never that simple. I do tend to think that Toussaint was a genuine believer in freedom from slavery, right? I truly believe he wanted freedom for the people of Saint-Domingue. I do think he sort of wanted to set the colony up in a good position, but I think he believed the best way to do that was for him to be in charge, right? So you can add in a little bit of self-interestedness there, and I do think he sort of felt justified in taking these actions that we may not agree with in order to achieve that ultimate goal. Right, that's sort of my take on the figure of Toussaint Louverture, who really looms large over the entirety of the Haitian Revolution and really the entire history of Haiti.
So again, people could imagine it. Both leaders had alienated supporters with their forced work policies, and those alienated groups.
But isn't that funny? In both of these territories, you have people under Toussaint who are saying, yeah, look at how he's forced us to go back to work. Maybe he will reimpose slavery. And you have people under Andre Rigaud saying the same thing. He's forced us to go back to the plantation. Maybe he will reimpose slavery. They're hurling the same accusations at each other. I don't think, they were really interested, especially Toussaint, in reimposing slavery. But like I said, they were interested in setting up this sort of coerced system of labor in order to keep the money moving.
Started believing that the other leader would never treat them like that, and both accused the other of perpetrating a race war, even though there were representatives of all of the island's groups on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Strip away the rhetoric, though, and this was a struggle
Yep.
between two leaders for supremacy.
Exactly.
On June 6th, 1799, Rigaud sent 4,000 troops to seize several border towns and negotiate the defection of one of Toussaint's veteran regiments. The act triggered a small uprising in Toussaint's northern territory, and he dodged 2 assassination attempts. In one, Toussaint had his hat shot off and an aide killed. In another, his carriage was peppered with a volley of bullets, though by pure chance, he was not inside. Thus began a civil war that would come to be known as the War of Knives. And it earned that title through blood.
Yeah.
Both sides offered no quarter, and prisoners, when taken at all, rarely lasted long. At the outset of the conflict, Rigaud's forces better.
I mean, we've seen that violence has always been a big part of the Haitian Revolution, and as it's continued, that violence has escalated. Now we have sort of direct infighting, and frankly, the Haitian Revolution was always sort of a civil conflict as well, right? There's all these different forces fighting against each other, but now you have these sort of revolutionary troops who were previously on the same side directly up against each other, and that heightened level of violence has now been turned against each other, right? So we see that escalated violence very clearly here.
Trained and equipped, made quick gains against Toussaint. But the northern general had an enormous numerical advantage and the increasingly open support of the United States. Not only were the Americans shipping Toussaint arms, at times, the United States Navy intervened directly.
And this is another sort of strange quirk of the era, that in the long run, the United States will not be an ally to Haiti, right? The U.S. will do Haiti dirty many times, from this point onwards, right? You can look even at the 20th century, the U.S. will occupy Haiti. Basically, the U.S. will not be an ally to an independent Haiti. But a strange little quirk. In this particular moment, Toussaint finds himself, through his own negotiations, with the U.S. as an ally. They actively help, sometimes quite actively, but more so through providing arms, right? Providing weapons, which is very important.
Providing fire support during sieges and blockading ports. The American consul even issued passports to Toussaint's ships, allowing them to pass the blockade when Rigaud's ships could not. And during this vicious fighting, one of Toussaint's commanders rose to prominence, Brigadier General Jacques Dessalines, a former slave who had fought through the revolution and who was known for massacring prisoners and rebels with such vindictiveness that Toussaint censored him for it. Though in fact, it is possible Toussaint actually ordered these reprisal killings, using Dessalines as a willing scapegoat to
It's more than possible.
avoid ruining his carefully crafted image of generosity and kindness.
Yeah, this is exactly what I said earlier. Toussaint, whenever he had some dirty work to do, I talked earlier about putting down, these uprisings that he faced, but more than that, whenever he had any dirty work to do, he'd send Dessalines, or Dessalines, however you want to pronounce it, and he would go and do that dirty work. Toussaint would distance himself, right? He didn't want to be involved. Sometimes he would reprimand Dessalines. He would say, I didn't approve of that. But the sort of trick here is that Toussaint was the one calling the shots. He was directing him, right? So this is about Toussaint maintaining his reputation, making sure he doesn't have to do the dirty work, but Dessalines was still essentially following Toussaint's lead.
The war ground to a stalemate. Rigaud besieged and pinned, but Toussaint, unwilling to expend the casualties necessary to dislodge him. And then, another commission arrived from France. Yeah, another one, announcing another change in government. General Napoleon Bonaparte had overthrown the political system and declared himself consul. His message? To reaffirm that in the eyes of France, Toussaint was the leader of Saint-Domingue. The war ended basically overnight, with Toussaint allowing Rigaud to slip away into exile in France.
Now we see, initially, Napoleon's like, all right, reaffirm Toussaint's position. Now, well, we've only got one episode left. Napoleon's going to be a big part of that episode. You could say he sort of changes his mind. But initially, I think Napoleon sees what is the truth of this situation, which is Toussaint is the only one who can really manage this situation, right? He's a great leader, a great general, but he's a great negotiator, right? If France wants to maintain control of Saint-Domingue and keep the cash crops going, Toussaint Louverture is the guy for that job. Napoleon recognizes that, at least in this moment, in the beginning.
Which left Toussaint free to invade Santo Domingo. While technically still French, was still administered by the Spanish. He claimed it was to prevent his free citizens from getting kidnapped and sold into slavery there, but it may have actually been a bid to bolster his forces through liberation and control all of the island's ports. Because Napoleon's representatives also brought word of a new constitution, one that rescinded the idea that colonies should have the same laws as France. Instead, they would have special laws, tailored to their unique conditions. In other words, Napoleon planned to bring back slavery.
Okay, that's a little cut and dry. It's a little more complicated than that. I essentially agree with that. What it is we talked about this in a previous episodes. If you remember, what the white planters of Saint-Domingue always argued was that the same laws that applied to France should not apply to the colony because they had unique circumstances. Now, what that really meant is they didn't want to be held down by French trade laws, and they didn't want any restrictions on their slave owning, right? And so, that sort of idea of special laws became a code for something that would benefit these slave owners, and that's always what they wanted. Now, the reimposition of these special laws, it was a massive red flag, right? It was basically the communication from Napoleon that he was planning to reinstate slavery, or maybe something like slavery. Now, this will become clearer, I guess, next time. At this moment, still, like I said, it's a little bit more vague than that. May not have been so cut and dry, but given Napoleon's actions over the next couple of years, yes, it is true. Napoleon decides that he has to reimpose slavery on the colony. It seems here that it was sort of this, like, Napoleon was like, okay, fine, then immediately shifted. It's not quite like that, but basically, Napoleon is like, yeah, I want this colony back under my control, I want slavery reimposed, and I want to keep the plantation economy going. But, we'll see more of that next time, but this is essentially true, but it's not quite that cut and dry, I will say.
In response, Toussaint wrote his own constitution, his own special laws, stating that Saint-Domingue was a sovereign black state, one that rejected slavery outright, and one where he was governor for life. He all but declared independence, and then prepared for invasion.
Yeah, they very much simplified the situation here. I don't necessarily love that presentation. I'll show you a couple passages from Toussaint's constitution since they brought it up. I think it's worth taking a look at that. So here we've got the Haitian Constitution of 1801, sometimes known as Toussaint's Constitution. This constitution would sort of set a precedent for future Haitian constitutions. Over the next couple of decades, we'll see a couple, and they often draw very extensively from Toussaint's constitution here. Now, the sort of point of this constitution was largely to cement the abolition of slavery, declare quite a lot of autonomy for Haiti, but still keep it officially tied to France as a colony. So we'll cover a couple of the articles here. And I will say, this was sort of a smart move from Toussaint, right? Because Napoleon imposes these special laws, which everyone knew was code for reimposing slavery. What Toussaint says is, oh, okay, Saint-Domingue has special, unique laws. Fine, let me write those laws for you. He says the colony has special laws. Fine, we'll run things exactly how we think they should be run. Right? So he's sort of taking advantage of this move, which he knows is likely to reimpose slavery. So we'll start off Article 3. This is the big one. There can be no slaves on this territory. Servitude has been forever abolished. All men are born, live, and die there, free and French. Right? So we can see this is the full abolition of slavery, but also, the claim here that they'll live and die French. Right? So along with that abolition of slavery, Toussaint very consciously has put, hey, we're still French. Right? So he's trying to continue to attach himself to France, right? It's sort of a sign of loyalty, even though it's not really going to work. I'll point out the next article. This is also an important one, where he says all men can work at all forms of employment, whatever their color. Right? So this is very much in line with Toussaint's vision of this multiracial society. Right? So what we'll see in future Haitian constitutions is the essentially privileging of people of color. Right? You know, the violence continues to escalate. We know that there's going to be very few white people left in Saint Domingue by the end, right? Largely due to that French invasion that leads to more violence and warfare. At this point, Toussaint is still striving for this multiracial society, and so what he says is, hey, everyone can work at any form of employment regardless of their skin color, right? He's going for this sort of colorblind constitution, which is not something that will be maintained by a lot of those future constitutions that are successors to this one. Now, there's a lot featured in this constitution, right? I mean, Toussaint is not technically declaring independence, but he really is setting up this autonomous colony or country, which is sort of what it's becoming. There's a lot of pretty classic French liberal stuff, but there's also some unique stuff to point out in here beyond what we've already talked about. So you have on cultivation and commerce, right? So here we're talking about agriculture, that all important plantation economy. 14. The colony, being essentially agricultural, cannot allow the least interruption in its labor and cultivation. Right? So this is an important one. So here is a recognition right in the Constitution that Toussaint is saying this colony is basically bound up in that plantation economy, and we cannot allow an interruption in that. Now, what that means in practice is what we've been talking about. If there's a revolt, right, from the cultivators, aka the farmers, Toussaint is willing to put it down with violence. And that's essentially what he's putting here. We have 15. Every habitation is a manufactory that demands a gathering together of cultivators and workers. It's the tranquil asylum of an active and constant family, of which the owner of the land or his representative is necessarily the father, and every cultivator and worker is a member of the family and a shareholder in its revenues. You can sort of say here, you know, Toussaint he's both establishing how necessary this agriculture is and how, frankly, forced or coerced it is. You don't have a choice, you gotta go back. But also, you know, he's saying, look, this isn't slavery. You are a shareholder in the revenues, all this sort of stuff, right? So he's basically setting up the labor regime here. Now, next, Toussaint is going to talk about the governance of the colony, and this is some very important stuff. The regime of the colony is determined by the laws proposed by the governor and rendered by an assembly of inhabitants who gather at fixed periods in the center of the colony under the title of Central Assembly of Saint-Domingue. And then, no law relative to the internal administration of the colony can be promulgated unless it bears the following formula. The Central Assembly of Saint-Domingue, on the proposition of the governor, renders the following law. So here, Toussaint is essentially setting up home rule. Right, he's saying here on Saint-Domingue, we govern our own affairs. We are not governed by France. Right? So, once again, Toussaint does not officially declare independence. We're still talking about the colony of Saint-Domingue, but he says that we are going to govern ourselves. This is the highest degree of autonomy before you get to independence. Once again, there is a lot more to talk about in this constitution. I'll link it down below if you'd like to take a look through on your own. It's really fascinating. I won't cover everything, but the last thing I'm going to cover is on the government, and in particular, the position of governor, right? So we've talked about how Toussaint wants home rule of the colony. He wants them to govern their own affairs. So now on the position of governor. So 27. The administrative reins of the colony are confided to a governor who directly corresponds with the government of the metropole, France, in all matters related to the colony. Okay, so there you go. So the governor's in charge, but he corresponds with France. Okay. Now 28. This is a big one. Right? It's probably one of the biggest parts of this constitution. When you hear people talking about this 1801 constitution, they're usually talking about the cementing, the abolition of slavery, that sort of racial equality that Toussaint lays out in Article 28. The Constitution names as governor Citizen Toussaint Louverture, General-in-Chief of the Army of Saint-Domingue, and in consideration of the important services that the general has rendered to the colony in the most critical circumstances of the revolution, and per the wishes of the grateful inhabitants, the reins are confided to him for the rest of his glorious life. So this constitution appoints Toussaint governor for life. how very Napoleon of him. Or, actually, when Napoleon crowns himself emperor, you could say, how very Toussaint of him, right? So Toussaint is saying, the governor has all this power, and I am the governor for life. Not only that, he says, the citizen who will have been chosen by General Toussaint Louverture to take the reins of government upon his death will take a vow to the Central Assembly to execute the Constitution of Saint-Domingue and to remain attached to the French government, and will be immediately installed in his functions. And all of this in the presence of the army generals in active service and the commanders in chief of the departments, who will all individually and without cease will pledge the new governor the vow of obedience to his orders. So here Toussaint is saying, I select my successor. He's sort of setting up a bit of a monarchy here. I select my successor, and that successor will, of course, remain attached to the French government, but all of y'all are going to pledge loyalty to my successor. Right? So that is what Toussaint is laying out here. He is laying out a lot in this Constitution, once again, cementing that freedom from slavery, right? That emancipation. He's laying out racial equality. He's also laying out this particular labor regime, right? Coerced labor, but you have a share in the profits. He's laying out Haitian self-government, and he's also establishing that he will be governor for life, an all-powerful governor who will be able to select his successor. But, of course, Saint-Domingue is still a colony of France. So you can see what I mean when I say this is the furthest level of autonomy before you get to full independence. That is what Toussaint is establishing here. So there we go. That's all we're going to cover with the Constitution of 1801. That's also the end of this episode of Extra Histories series on the Haitian Revolution. I know we ended with quite the long segment separated from that episode, but another good one, an interesting one. We primarily covered sort of the infighting among the revolutionaries this time, but we basically ended with Toussaint taking that ultimate control, as we saw in his constitution, and with Napoleon essentially indicating that he would reimpose slavery. You know, once again, a little more vague than they pointed out there, but when we see next time what Napoleon's going to do, it's pretty clear that he wants to return, take control of Haiti, and reimpose slavery, right? So we'll have to deal with all that in the next episode. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to exclusive reaction content. Now, with all of that out of the way, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.